What if everything you believe is just a habit of the mind? David Hume destroyed the foundations of human knowledge with one simple question. How do we know the sun will rise tomorrow? This 18th century philosopher proved that science, morality, and even our sense of self are built not on logic, but on emotions and habits. We live in illusions, but here's the paradox. We can't exist without them. Hume revealed that reason isn't the king of nature, but the slave of our passions. Every belief we hold stands on shaky ground, yet that's exactly what makes us human. Ready to discover how history's greatest skeptic turned our understanding of reality upside down? Get comfortable and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In this video, we'll break down David Hume's entire philosophy. Part 1. Skepticism and Natural Belief. David Hume crafted one of the most intricate and enduring explorations of philosophical skepticism in Western thought. He neither dismissed skeptical arguments as trivial wordplay, nor accepted them as grounds for despair or inaction. Rather, he illuminated how such arguments expose deep truths about the limitations of human knowledge, even as they ultimately prove irrelevant to how people actually live and think. Instead of allowing skepticism to lead to intellectual paralysis, Hume revealed its dual character. It uncovers the fragility of our reasoning processes, while also exposing how little that fragility matters to everyday human experience. His treatment became a foundational model for understanding the complex interplay between abstract philosophical critique and the instinctive workings of human psychology. Through this, he arrived at a balanced view, one that respected the force of skeptical challenges, yet defended the natural instincts that drive human behavior and decision-making. Historically, skeptical philosophers had concentrated their efforts on exposing the flaws in sensory perception. They emphasized how easily our senses can deceive us, how objects shift appearance depending on context, how illusions and hallucinations arise, and how we are forever trapped within our own subjective experience, unable to compare our perceptions with any objective reality beyond them. From these observations, they concluded that we can never attain certainty about the world as it truly is. Yet Hume perceived that this classical form of skepticism left a critical assumption untouched: the presumed reliability of reason itself. It took for granted that rational analysis could legitimately assess the boundaries of human knowledge. To address this oversight, Hume proposed a deeper and more radical skepticism, one that cast doubt not just on sensory data, but on the validity of rational thought and inference. This more profound skepticism led Hume to question the very foundations of logic and mathematics. He argued that even our most basic logical conclusions and mathematical principles rest upon psychological habits rather than objective justification. They are, in essence, products of the mind that cannot be independently verified through reason alone. Central to this deeper skeptical stance was Hume's examination of inductive reasoning. He famously demonstrated that all knowledge about matters of fact depends on the belief that the future will resemble the past. However, this belief, so crucial to science, everyday decision-making, and even survival, cannot be logically proven. Attempting to justify it through experience or logic leads to circular reasoning. We expect the future to reflect the past because it always has, a rationale that assumes what it tries to prove. As a result, even our most rigorous scientific models and our most reliable daily habits rely on an assumption of consistency in nature, an assumption with no logical foundation. We have no definitive reason to believe that the laws of logic will function tomorrow as they do today, or that the truths of mathematics will remain stable over time. Carried to its full extent, this skeptical reasoning forces us to admit that nearly all of our beliefs about the world are built on assumptions that defy rational validation. This far-reaching doubt encompasses not only our faith in the external world, but also our trust in memory, logical inference, and even the continuity of the self. However, Hume uncovered a surprising and deeply human insight at this point of philosophical extremity. The mind cannot maintain such radical doubt for long. No matter how compelling the skeptical argument, individuals inevitably revert to trusting their perceptions, depending on memory and expecting familiar patterns to persist. Even those fully immersed in skeptical contemplation unconsciously lean on the very faculties they are questioning. Engaging in skeptical analysis itself requires one to presume the validity of logic, remember previous steps in reasoning, and believe in the presence of other conscious beings capable of understanding and engaging in philosophical debate. Thus, skepticism collapses under its own weight. It critiques the very foundations that make it possible, thereby undermining its own authority. Hume concluded that while these arguments might possess impressive intellectual force, they lack the capacity to truly shake our instinctive convictions or alter how we operate in the world. Reflecting on his personal experience, Hume offered a remarkably introspective account of this internal conflict. In moments of solitary contemplation in his study, he could follow skeptical reasoning to its most extreme conclusions, feeling the full emotional and intellectual impact of doubt, not only about the existence of the external world, but also about his own personal identity. Whenever he stepped away from his study and rejoined the flow of everyday life, sharing meals with friends or enjoying a game of backgammon, his philosophical uncertainties would vanish entirely. In their place, a natural and unshakable confidence in everyday beliefs would reassert itself without effort. This contrast between skeptical doubt and instinctive conviction exposed something fundamental about the workings of the human mind. Although deep reflection can momentarily erode our trust in specific beliefs, it lacks the power to permanently dismantle the psychological forces that originally produced them. Philosophical doubt, it seems, can disrupt belief only temporarily. The mechanisms that support natural conviction lie deeper within our mental architecture than deliberate reasoning does, and they continue to operate even when rational thought calls their validity into question. This realization led Hume to draw a distinction between two fundamentally different types of mental activity, each governed by its own internal logic. On one hand, philosophical reasoning obeys the strict demands of logic and evidence, pursuing conclusions to their fullest extent regardless of how they affect daily life. On the other hand, natural belief is driven by psychological tendencies shaped by evolutionary needs. These evolved mental processes serve practical functions. They support survival and effective engagement with the world. Without conscious effort or reflective thought, they instill a default trust in the external world, in the accuracy of memory, in the persistence of personal identity, and in the regularity of natural events. These beliefs arise spontaneously and intuitively, requiring no rational justification to be effective. What is most striking is that these mechanisms remain active even when philosophical inquiry reveals that the assumptions they rest on cannot be defended through reason. Hume believed that this psychological understanding offered a way to address skepticism in practice, without dismissing its intellectual depth. Skeptical arguments illuminate crucial truths about the limitations of rational thought and the psychological, not logical basis of our core beliefs. They expose the fragile foundations of knowledge and invite us to acknowledge the limits of human reason. Yet these arguments do not compel us to reject our basic beliefs or to adopt a skeptical lifestyle. According to Hume, the appropriate response to skepticism is not rigid denial or crippling doubt, but a tempered form of skepticism, one that recognizes both the strengths and the boundaries of skeptical inquiry. We should remain receptive to what skepticism reveals, while still trusting the natural beliefs that enable us to function in the world. This measured attitude toward skepticism shaped Hume's broader view of how philosophy should relate to everyday life. For Hume, the highest role of philosophy is not to displace our natural instincts with abstract theories, but to uncover important truths about human nature and the limits of our understanding. Philosophy enriches our perspective by explaining, not replacing, the psychological foundations of our beliefs and behaviors. The true contribution of philosophical thought lies in illuminating how our minds work and why we hold the beliefs we do, not in offering substitute grounds for those beliefs. This naturalistic turn in Hume's philosophy placed human psychology and social behavior at the center of philosophical investigation rather than abstract metaphysical speculation. From this perspective, the most pressing philosophical questions are not about the ultimate essence of reality, but about the developmental story of human thought and the cognitive mechanisms that shape belief. This shift, from metaphysical speculation to psychological inquiry, would leave a lasting mark on the evolution of philosophy, as well as on the emerging fields of psychology and the social sciences. Part 2. Hume and the Bundle Theory of Mind. When David Hume turned his empirical gaze toward the study of human consciousness and personal identity, he uncovered insights that not only surprised him, but also disrupted deeply rooted assumptions about the self that had shaped Western philosophy for generations. His inquiry into what underlies the continuity of personhood, what makes you feel like the same individual across different moments in time, led him to a striking conclusion. The self, as traditionally imagined, is not an observable reality but a conceptual illusion. This realization carried profound consequences, not just for philosophy and psychology, but also for how we understand moral agency, personal growth, and the nature of human existence. Hume's dissection of the mind remains one of his most perceptive and influential contributions to the understanding of the human condition. Historically, both philosophical and religious traditions have posited that personal identity depends on the existence of a stable, enduring essence, often conceived as a soul or immutable self, that serves as the anchor of consciousness. This enduring substance was thought to remain constant amid the ever-changing experiences of life, providing the unified identity that links one's past, present, and future. Thinkers differed on whether this essence was material or immaterial, singular or composite, mortal or eternal. But across these debates, there was a broad consensus. Without some permanent self, the coherence of personal identity would collapse. In such a view, moral accountability, selfhood, and the meaningfulness of individual life all rely on the reality of a stable inner core. Hume, however, approached the question from a radically empirical standpoint. He urged readers to turn inward and investigate their own minds, to try to locate this supposed unchanging self through introspection. What he discovered, and encouraged others to discover for themselves, was both surprising and disconcerting. When he examined his own consciousness most closely, Hume reported encountering nothing but a succession of fleeting perceptions, sensations of heat or cold, sights and sounds, emotions like love or anger, and feelings of pleasure or pain. At no point could he detect an underlying self distinct from these passing experiences. He found no observer behind the experiences, only the experiences themselves. In essence, introspection revealed a shifting series of mental states, but never a stable entity that could be identified as the self. What we call consciousness, Hume argued, is merely the ever-changing collection of thoughts, feelings, and sensations, without any enduring subject that owns or experiences them. From this observation, Hume developed what would later be called the bundle theory of mind, a perspective that marked a revolutionary break from traditional conceptions of the self. According to this theory, the mind is not a thing that has experiences. Rather, it is the totality of those experiences. There is no core self that endures across time, only a dynamic aggregation of perceptions held together by psychological patterns. In Hume's words, the self is merely a bundle or collection of different perceptions, constantly shifting and in perpetual motion. There is no inner stage upon which mental events appear, no witnessing observer within, and no enduring tenant of the mind who remains unchanged as experiences come and go. The self, then, is not a metaphysical substance, but the stream of mental activity itself. Our ongoing sense of being the same person, our personal identity, is not rooted in an underlying essence, but in the way mental events are connected over time. This identity is constructed by the mind's own psychological operations, which weaves separate experiences into a coherent narrative. Hume identified several mechanisms by which this illusion of a unified self is maintained. One is the principle of resemblance, which allows the mind to link similar experiences across time, even if they are not exact copies. For instance, recalling the sight of a red rose from yesterday creates a mental image that closely resembles, but does not replicate, the original perception. This resemblance fosters a sense of continuity between past and present mental states. Another is the principle of causation, which links mental events in a way that suggests one thought or feeling gives rise to another. This creates the impression of a continuous psychological process unfolding through time, a mental system with internal coherence and direction. Together, these principles produce the powerful illusion of a unified, enduring self, a center of experience that remains stable even as its contents change. Yet for Hume, this sense of self is not evidence of a metaphysical entity, but the product of natural psychological tendencies to organize and connect our mental lives. The simple urge to write a letter leads you to recall where you last placed your pen, prompting you to walk over to your desk. This sequence of events forms a causal chain that links what would otherwise be separate mental occurrences. Most crucially, memory forges connections between long-past experiences and your current awareness, allowing you to build a coherent narrative of your life that can stretch across many years or even decades. David Hume, however, argued that these psychological links do not necessitate the presence of a permanent, underlying self. According to him, the coherence of consciousness arises from natural mental mechanisms that function automatically and instinctively, rather than from any enduring metaphysical essence. In the same way that a river remains identifiable over time, despite the continuous movement and change of its waters, personal identity is maintained through the continuity of mental experiences, not through any fixed inner substance. This continuity is preserved despite the ever-changing nature of thoughts and perceptions, thanks to ongoing psychological connections, rather than any immutable core. Hume believed traditional philosophers erred by insisting that the unity of the mind required a stable metaphysical foundation, when in reality, such coherence can be fully explained through ordinary psychological processes acting on constantly shifting mental content. Hume's interpretation of identity carried significant consequences for how he approached moral responsibility and the idea of personal growth. If the self is not a static entity, but rather a fluid sequence of psychological states, then individuals are not eternally bound to specific character traits or behavior patterns. There is enough psychological consistency to hold people morally accountable for their actions, but also enough flexibility to allow genuine moral progress. You remain answerable for what you have done because your past behaviors are linked to your present mental condition through continuous psychological processes. Yet you are not doomed to repeat your former mistakes, since your character can transform through new experiences and intentional self-improvement. Viewing identity as a process rather than a substance supports both moral accountability and the possibility of meaningful change. It highlights the role individuals can play in shaping their own development by making deliberate choices and cultivating new habits. The self in this view is not a fixed possession, but a dynamic creation that evolves through action and intention. Hume also considered the social factors that influence personal identity, acknowledging that our psychological development occurs in constant interaction with others and within cultural contexts. Our perception of ourselves as continuous and unified beings is shaped in part by how others see and treat us over time. Social acknowledgement reinforces the internal processes that sustain our sense of identity, while the roles and relationships we engage in provide stable structures through which our identity can grow and solidify. Thus, the self is more than just a collection of psychological experiences. It is also a social construct that emerges through participation in shared human environments. This idea anticipated later insights from social psychology and sociology, which emphasized the communal roots of individual identity. Hume's thinking suggested that to truly understand personal identity, we must also consider the cultural and historical conditions that inform how people come to understand themselves and their roles in society. Still, despite the bold conclusions of his bundle theory, Hume recognized that it clashed with innate aspects of human psychology, leading to deep philosophical tensions. People naturally feel as though they are consistent, enduring selves who persist through various psychological changes, even if reasoned reflection casts doubt on the existence of such a stable self. Hume described this as one of the most profound and unsettling challenges within his entire philosophy. Although the bundle theory appeared to be supported by empirical observations of the mind, it conflicted so sharply with instinctive human beliefs that even Hume himself admitted struggling to fully accept his own findings. This unresolved conflict between logical analysis and natural psychological tendencies demonstrated the intricacy of human self-perception and the difficulty of reconciling different ways of understanding identity. It also exemplified Hume's intellectual integrity as he openly acknowledged the problems and limitations in his own system rather than rigidly defending it against all criticism. Part 3. The Passions and Human Motivation. David Hume crafted one of the most comprehensive and psychologically nuanced theories of emotion and motivation in the entire history of philosophy. In contrast to earlier philosophers who treated the passions as chaotic impulses that undermine reason, Hume contended that emotional and motivational states are the essential forces that animate all human behavior. His in-depth psychological study of the passions uncovered the intricate processes through which people develop emotional bonds, pursue objectives, and engage with others socially. This framework laid the groundwork for his moral philosophy and social theory, grounding human institutions and practices not in abstract rationalism, but in natural psychological inclinations. Hume made a key distinction between two primary categories of mental phenomena, each governed by different psychological dynamics. On one hand, there are impressions and ideas. These relate to our sensory experiences and memory, involving the intellect's ability to register and recall information. On the other hand, passions are emotional and motivational responses that do more than merely color our thoughts. They actively drive our behavior. According to Hume, the passions serve as the core motivators of all human actions. They give rise to desires, fears, hopes, aversions, and other affective states that shape our direction in life. In their absence, humans would be passive spectators of their mental experiences, capable of perception and thought, yet devoid of any impulse to act. While reason can determine logical relationships and identify the means to achieve specific ends, it is only through passion that those ends gain significance and urgency. Therefore, to understand human nature and behavior, individually and collectively, one must first examine the passions. Hume also offered a detailed classification of the passions, organizing them according to their underlying psychological mechanisms. He identified a category of direct passions, which arise immediately in response to experiences of pleasure and pain, or perceptions of benefit and harm. For example, touching a hot surface instantly produces pain and a subsequent aversion without requiring any conscious deliberation or social influence. In contrast, indirect passions emerge through more elaborate mental processes. These involve judgments that link the self to other people, objects, or events, incorporating social and cultural dimensions. Emotions such as pride, humility, love, and hatred are shaped not just by immediate experiences, but also by how individuals interpret their relationships, assess causes, and compare themselves to others within a social context. These indirect emotions are central to social dynamics. They drive people to seek validation, avoid disapproval, form relationships, and uphold their reputations within a community. They function as psychological engines for social engagement and cooperation. Hume regarded the emotion of pride as a particularly illuminating example for understanding the mechanics of human feeling. Pride is triggered when someone recognizes a quality or accomplishment they possess, something they believe others will view positively. The emotional experience of pride involves a sophisticated interplay of associations: the self, a valued object or achievement, and the pleasurable anticipation of others' approval. Take pride in one's home, for instance. The individual links their sense of self to their attractive house, and this connection is reinforced by imagining how others will admire their taste or status. The emotion of pride is thus not just about pleasure, but also about self-assessment, societal comparison, and perceived recognition. In this way, pride exposes the inherently social structure of individual psychology. It shows that personal emotions are deeply intertwined with our awareness of others' judgments and expectations. Humility, in turn, represents the inverse of pride. It arises when we identify negative traits or failures within ourselves that we believe others will see as unworthy or shameful. The same psychological processes that give rise to pride through positive associations generate humility when those associations are unfavorable. Hume made a critical observation about the interplay between pride and humility. Both emotions stem from self-assessment in light of social norms. This suggests that our understanding of ourselves is not formed in isolation, but is deeply rooted in how we compare ourselves to others. Rather than being purely internal or introspective, self-awareness is shaped by our perceptions of how we are viewed by others and how our accomplishments align with collective standards and expectations. This perspective anticipated developments in social psychology that would emerge much later, particularly research into how our self-concept is shaped by social interactions and the role that comparison with others plays in shaping our psychological framework. Emotions such as love and hatred follow a similar psychological structure, but are directed outward, toward other people rather than the self. Love arises when we link someone to positive traits or accomplishments that evoke pleasure and draw our interest and affection. Conversely, hatred develops when we associate someone with harmful characteristics or actions that provoke discomfort and rejection. However, Hume stressed that these emotions are not merely reflexive reactions to good or bad traits in others. They are the result of nuanced mental processes that consider the causes behind a person's behavior, the broader social situation, and prevailing cultural beliefs. We are more inclined to love those whose admirable traits appear to stem from personal effort rather than from chance or fortune. Similarly, we tend to harbor greater resentment or dislike toward individuals whose harmful actions seem to reflect their core character, as opposed to being caused by external pressures or circumstances beyond their control. Through his exploration of human emotions, Hume reached several significant conclusions about motivation and moral psychology. First, he argued that all human behavior is ultimately driven by emotions and desires that cannot be fully justified by reason. Our fundamental aims and values arise from innate human feelings, not from logical deductions. This means that moral and political thought must be grounded in the emotional realities of human nature, rather than built solely on abstract principles of reason. Second, he demonstrated that human psychology is intrinsically social. It is shaped through continuous engagement with others and a persistent awareness of communal norms and judgments. This insight implies that to truly understand human behavior, we must consider the social and cultural contexts in which individuals live, rather than focusing solely on internal mental mechanisms. Third, Hume uncovered the intricate cognitive processes behind even seemingly simple emotional reactions. He showed that human psychology is equipped with sophisticated tools for evaluating social relationships and maneuvering within complex social landscapes. These discoveries about the nature of emotion form the cornerstone of Hume's moral philosophy and social theory. If human behavior is rooted in natural sentiment rather than in cold rationality, then moral philosophy should center on identifying and nurturing the feelings that support human well-being, rather than trying to deduce moral truths from abstract reasoning. Furthermore, if individual psychology is inherently social, then political systems should be crafted to align with human emotional and social tendencies, rather than expecting people to overcome their natural dispositions. Hume's naturalistic perspective on ethics and politics called for an empirical approach, treating questions of morality and governance as issues best understood through the scientific study of human psychology and the dynamics of social life. Part 4. Moral Sentiments and the Foundation of Ethics. David Hume transformed the field of moral philosophy by turning the focus away from abstract rational laws and toward the psychological forces that genuinely shape human moral behavior. Rather than trying to deduce ethical rules from pure reason, Hume explored how people actually make moral judgments and what emotional and cognitive mechanisms drive moral conduct. Hume's empirical method in ethics led him to conclude that moral evaluations are rooted in natural human emotions, not in objective moral facts. Yet he maintained that grounding ethics in human sentiment does not weaken its importance, it strengthens it. By understanding the emotional foundations of morality, we can develop more practical and effective strategies for moral education, social reform, and character development. Through careful reflection on his own moral intuitions and encouraging others to do the same, Hume uncovered a vital insight into how people psychologically engage in ethical reasoning. He realized that moral judgments are tied to a specific kind of emotional reaction, distinct from personal preferences or aesthetic likes and dislikes. For instance, saying that murder is wrong is not equivalent to saying you dislike a certain food or genre of music. When we morally condemn something like murder, we're expressing what Hume called a sentiment of disapprobation, a feeling with a broad social dimension that goes beyond individual taste. This disapproval isn't limited to personal experience. We condemn murder whether it happens nearby or in distant lands, whether it affects us directly or occurs in faraway times. That universality points to the presence of an impartial, expansive sympathy, a concern for human well-being that stretches beyond narrow self-interest. Hume believed this moral sentiment is rooted in the evolved structure of human psychology, shaped over time by both evolutionary necessity and social development. Human beings, he argued, possess innate sympathetic tendencies, natural capacities that enable us to feel, in part, the joys and sufferings of others. Observing someone else's happiness or pain stirs a corresponding emotion within us. Although these emotional echoes are generally less intense than the first-hand experience, they arise instinctively, not through moral instruction or intellectual reasoning. This built-in emotional resonance fosters a sense of connection and concern between people. Moral sentiments grow out of these natural sympathetic impulses, expanding and becoming more nuanced through social experience and cultural learning. This sympathy forms the emotional and psychological bedrock upon which moral evaluations are built. Yet it is also shaped by the society in which it develops. While sympathy is a natural capacity, the way it is expressed, what we sympathize with, and to what degree, is deeply influenced by cultural and interpersonal context. However, Hume was also aware that raw sympathy has its limits. People tend to empathize more with those who are close to them, family, friends, or members of the same community, and less with distant strangers or those from different eras or cultures. This natural partiality stands in contrast to the universal and impartial nature of moral judgment, which demands that we consider everyone's interests, not just those closest to us. Because of this tension, Hume sought to understand how humans move from biased, instinctive sympathy to the more even-handed perspective that morality often requires. He found that mature moral reasoning relies on a process of psychological refinement, an extension of our sympathies beyond their natural bounds. This process involves adopting what Hume described as a general point of view, a mental stance that lifts us out of our immediate interests and relationships. Through this lens, we evaluate actions from a broader, more balanced perspective. Rather than judging from the standpoint of personal connection, we imagine ourselves as impartial observers who weigh the effects of actions on all those involved, without granting special favor to ourselves or our circle. This psychological framework does not negate the role of emotion in moral judgment. Instead, it enhances and channels our innate sympathetic reactions into more consistent and socially beneficial forms of ethical evaluation. By adopting a broader, impartial perspective, individuals can support actions that serve the common good, even when such actions oppose their own immediate interests, and reject behaviors that inflict needless harm, even if they offer personal gain. The ability to make fair and impartial moral judgments arises naturally through social engagement and communication, as people come to recognize that shared moral standards facilitate cooperation and mutual understanding. Societies that cultivate effective moral norms and systems of evaluation are better equipped to address collective challenges and uphold social stability. David Hume's exploration of moral sentiment led him to crucial insights about how individual psychology interacts with broader social structures. Moral norms are neither arbitrary rules enforced upon reluctant individuals, nor are they objective truths existing apart from human experience. Rather, they evolve from the natural development of human sympathy, shaped and refined through social engagement and cultural learning. As a result, successful moral education should aim to nurture and expand our natural capacity for empathy, rather than relying on the rigid imposition of abstract, rational doctrines through authoritarian methods. Children come to understand morality not primarily by memorizing fixed rules, but by engaging in relationships that build their empathetic understanding of how actions affect the well-being of others. In the same way, institutions should be designed to align with human psychological tendencies, creating environments where moral feelings can be expressed and reinforced, rather than expecting individuals to suppress or transcend their emotional nature entirely. Hume's sentiment-based approach to ethics also carried important implications for understanding moral disagreement and cultural diversity in ethical norms. If moral evaluations stem from human emotions refined through lived experience, we should anticipate differences in moral customs between societies, alongside recurring themes that reflect our shared psychological makeup. Across cultures, common ethical principles emerge: prohibitions against unjustified violence, the value of honesty in cooperative interactions, and expectations to care for children and other vulnerable individuals. Nonetheless, the exact ways these principles are enacted can vary significantly depending on a society's history, environment, and social structures. This perspective implies that moral philosophy should seek to uncover the core human sentiments that serve as universal foundations for ethical thought, while also acknowledging legitimate cultural differences in how those sentiments are manifested and institutionalized. A rigid, dogmatic insistence on specific moral rules without considering their psychological roots and societal context is likely to prove both ineffective and detrimental to human well-being. Hume's ethical theory thus charted a balanced course between moral relativism and strict moral absolutism, highlighting both the natural basis and the social evolution of moral understanding. Ethical norms are not mere expressions of personal taste or cultural habit. They are grounded in universal aspects of human psychology, which place real constraints on what types of moral systems can genuinely promote human flourishing. At the same time, these norms are not immutable metaphysical truths discoverable solely through reason. They arise from emotional dispositions that have been molded by both evolutionary forces and cultural environments. Accordingly, moral philosophy should adopt a naturalistic method, one that includes empirical study of human behavior and psychology, paired with practical efforts to foster the emotional capacities that underpin moral reasoning and action. This naturalistic vision of ethics anticipated many later advances in fields like moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, and applied ethics. By stressing the importance of understanding human nature, it laid the groundwork for more effective strategies in moral education and social policy, and remains one of Hume's most enduring and impactful contributions to our understanding of ourselves. Part 5. The Empirical Revolution. David Hume initiated a profound shift in philosophy based on a single, deceptively simple idea, one that would ultimately reshape how we understand knowledge itself. He claimed that all human knowledge must originate from sensory experience. This viewpoint, known as empiricism, might initially seem self-evident, but Hume pursued it to its furthest logical consequences and uncovered insights no one had anticipated. At its core, Hume's principle implies that if everything we know comes through the five senses, then the limits of human understanding are both narrower and more intriguing than anyone had previously believed. To see what Hume meant, consider the most basic act of perception. When you look at what you think is a red apple resting on a wooden table, your eyes are actually registering light waves reflected from different surfaces. These waves spark chemical reactions in your retina, which generate electrical signals sent through the optic nerve to your brain. Your brain processes these signals, and the result is the conscious experience of seeing the apple. But here's where Hume makes a pivotal observation. You never come into contact with the apple itself, only with your brain's interpretation of certain sensory inputs. If a real apple exists independently of your mind, it remains forever concealed behind the filter of perception. In this sense, reality is always mediated by sensory data, never directly known. This realization led Hume to distinguish between two fundamental categories of mental content. He called the vivid, immediate experiences we receive through our senses impressions. In contrast, the mental images or recollections we form later, our memories or imaginings, he referred to as ideas. For example, seeing a rose in bright sunlight gives you a sharp, vibrant impression. Remembering that rose later, or picturing a similar one in your mind, involves ideas, fainter versions of the original impression. Hume argued that every idea, no matter how intricate or abstract, must be built from basic impressions acquired through the senses. This became known as the copy theory of ideas, and it would form the bedrock for all of Hume's later explorations into the workings of the human mind. The consequences of this theory were immediate and far-reaching. If all ideas are derived from impressions, then any concept not grounded in sensory experience is either confused or meaningless. Take, for instance, the idea of an infinitely perfect God. While we might have impressions of goodness, power, or wisdom, we have no direct experience of infinite perfection itself. Likewise, we've never sensed anything like a substance, a soul, or a necessary connection between causes and effects. According to Hume, such notions are either empty jargon or clumsy combinations of simpler ideas, patched together without justification. This perspective radically transformed how philosophers thought about the link between language and reality. Rather than assuming that every meaningful word corresponds to something real in the world, Hume demanded that we verify each concept by tracing it back to actual experience. Words like substance, essence, and absolute truth may sound deep and impressive, but if they can't be linked to sensory impressions, then they reveal more about the ambiguities of language than they do about the structure of reality itself. This insight would influence generations of philosophers, many of whom shifted their focus away from grand metaphysical speculation and toward the careful analysis of language and concepts. Hume also made a groundbreaking discovery about how the mind organizes and connects different ideas. He identified three key principles of association that explain the natural flow of thought, how one idea leads to another. The first is resemblance. Thinking about one thing often brings similar things to mind. A photograph of a friend, for instance, immediately reminds you of that person because of the likeness between the image and your stored memories. The second principle is contiguity in space and time. This explains why we link together things that occur near each other. When we hear thunder, we often think of lightning, because those experiences frequently happen together. The third principle is cause and effect, which connects ideas based on patterns of influence. For example, the smell of smoke conjures the thought of fire because past experience has taught us that the two often go hand in hand. The principles of association unveiled a striking truth about the nature of the human mind. Much of what we commonly regard as reasoning is, in fact, driven by automatic psychological processes that link our thoughts through instinctive patterns. We do not willfully decide to connect lightning with thunder or smoke with fire. These associations arise involuntarily, shaped by the structure of our past experiences. This realization pointed to a deeper idea. Human thought operates under its own set of psychological laws, just as the physical world is governed by natural laws. Recognizing and understanding these mental laws became a central aim in Hume's ambition to construct a science of human nature, one as rigorous and methodical as physics or chemistry. From this empirical foundation, Hume arrived at a provocative insight about the boundaries of human reason. If all knowledge originates in sensory experience, then anything that lies beyond the senses remains unknowable. We cannot determine whether our perceptions align with actual external objects, whether a world outside our minds truly exists, or whether other individuals possess conscious experiences akin to our own. What we can observe directly are only the contents of our own awareness, the ongoing stream of sensations and ideas that make up our inner lives. This perspective, referred to as phenomenalism, proposed that philosophy should concentrate on identifying the structures and patterns within subjective experience, rather than speculating about a reality that lies outside of it. This modest yet groundbreaking viewpoint would go on to influence generations of thinkers, all grappling with the complex interplay between mind and world. Part 6. The Problem of Induction. David Hume identified what many regard as one of the most profound and unsettling challenges in the realm of human understanding, a dilemma so deep that it continues to perplex philosophers and scientists nearly 300 years later. This issue targets the very core of how we reason scientifically and navigate daily life, casting doubt on the reliability of everything we assume to know about the world. At the heart of this problem lies a basic cognitive habit, making inferences about what will happen in the future based on patterns we've observed in the past. We rely on this type of reasoning constantly and almost unconsciously. Yet Hume revealed that this seemingly self-evident process lacks any solid rational foundation. Take, for example, the familiar expectation that the sun will rise tomorrow. This belief appears entirely rational, supported by an unbroken history of sunrises experienced by humanity. Day after day, the sun has appeared in the sky, a consistent pattern confirmed by billions of human observations over millennia. From this extensive historical record, we naturally predict that the same will occur again. But Hume posed a disarmingly simple question. What grounds do we have, logically speaking, for believing that the future will reflect the past? At first glance, the question might seem trivial. Surely the future will resemble the past. That's just how the world works. But Hume dug deeper, showing that this obvious belief cannot be proven, neither through logical deduction nor empirical observation. Logic alone offers no support because there's nothing inherently contradictory in imagining that the laws of nature could suddenly change. From a purely logical perspective, it's entirely coherent to suppose that the sun might fail to rise tomorrow, that gravity could cease to operate, or that fire might stop consuming wood. While these scenarios appear fantastical, they are not logically absurd in the way a square circle or a married bachelor would be. Perhaps, then, we could appeal to our past experiences of nature's consistency to justify our confidence in future patterns. After all, history shows us a world that behaves in a remarkably stable and predictable way. However, Hume demonstrated that this approach leads to circular reasoning. To use past consistency as a basis for expecting future consistency, we must already presuppose that the future will resemble the past. In other words, we're assuming the very conclusion we're trying to prove. A classic example of begging the question: it's like measuring a ruler against itself and declaring it accurate. The reasoning loops back on itself and ultimately proves nothing new. The implications become even more troubling when applied to science. Scientific inquiry depends heavily on inductive reasoning, the idea that what holds true in observed cases will also hold true in unobserved ones. For instance, when a scientist drops two objects of different weights and observes that they fall at the same rate, she infers a general law about gravity. But this inference, this leap from specific observations to universal laws, can't be justified through logic alone. There's no deductive guarantee that gravity will behave tomorrow exactly as it does today. And yet, without assuming such regularity, the entire foundation of empirical science begins to crumble. Hume had uncovered a disturbing truth, that all scientific knowledge ultimately relies on an assumption that cannot be rationally proven. This realization led Hume to draw a crucial distinction between two kinds of reasoning. First, there are relations of ideas, truths grounded in the logical connections between concepts, such as mathematical equations or definitional statements. For example, saying that all bachelors are unmarried is necessarily true because it follows directly from the definition of the term. Such truths are certain and knowable through reason alone. However, these kinds of truths tell us nothing about the world itself. They exist entirely within the realm of ideas. In contrast, matters of fact pertain to real-world events and conditions that go beyond mere definitions. Statements like, "the sun will rise tomorrow," or "fire burns wood," refer to empirical claims about reality. And as Hume showed, these cannot be established through pure logic. Hume argued that all our reasoning concerning factual matters ultimately hinges on our understanding of cause and effect. For instance, we anticipate the sunrise not through direct logic, but because we believe that Earth's rotation produces this recurring phenomenon. Similarly, we expect fire to consume wood because we hold that fire's chemical nature brings about combustion when it encounters flammable substances. Yet our grasp of causality doesn't stem from logic or pure reason. It arises entirely from experience. We never directly perceive causation itself. What we witness is the repeated association of events that we interpret as being causally linked. This insight led Hume to his most influential conclusion about the limitations of inductive reasoning. According to Hume, our conviction that the future will mirror the past is not something we logically deduce. It is instead a mental habit formed through repeated exposure to similar experiences. When we continually observe the same outcomes following specific events, we instinctively develop the belief that this pattern will persist. This belief does not rest on reason, but rather on what Hume described as custom or habit. Our minds are inherently wired to form expectations based on recurring experiences. This is not a defect in human cognition, but a fundamental feature of how we interpret the world, a world that tends to display consistent patterns. However, the key issue Hume identified is that this psychological process, while indispensable, cannot be rationally defended. Despite its importance for daily functioning and survival, the mechanism by which we form expectations lacks a logical foundation. Hume saw this as having deep consequences for our understanding of knowledge and science. If our most fundamental beliefs are grounded not in reason, but in involuntary mental habits, then the structure of our knowledge is far more fragile than it appears. We cannot logically demonstrate that future events will conform to past patterns, yet we are psychologically incapable of doubting that they will. Nor can we definitively prove that scientific theories describe permanent truths about nature, and yet we are unable to proceed in life without presuming that they do. This, for Hume, revealed a lasting contradiction at the heart of human existence. We are capable of recognizing the boundaries of rational thought, but we are not capable of living strictly within those boundaries. The tension between philosophical skepticism and practical belief is one we are destined to carry. Part 7. Causation and Necessary Connection. Among all the concepts that David Hume explored through his empirical philosophy, none proved more pivotal or more startling than the notion of causation. The link between cause and effect appears to be one of the most self-evident and foundational aspects of how the world works. Strike a match and it ignites. Drop a rock and it falls. Touch a flame and it burns you. These types of causal interactions seem so intuitive and inevitable that most people never stop to question their nature. Yet Hume did just that. He scrutinized what truly occurs during these events, and in doing so, exposed that our conventional belief in causation is largely a psychological construction. According to Hume, the idea of causation reveals more about how the human mind functions than about the actual structure of the external world. Ordinarily, when people consider cause and effect, they imagine some kind of unseen power or force binding the two together. They envision the match not merely striking, but somehow causing the flame through a compelling inner mechanism, as though a hidden chain of necessity forces the effect to follow the cause. This common-sense view implies that causes possess an intrinsic power that necessitates their outcomes. Hume directly challenged this assumption by posing a basic but profound question. What do we actually perceive when we witness a causal event? If you watch someone strike a match and see it burst into flame, what enters your senses? You observe the motion of the match across a rough surface. You notice sparks, followed by a flame. But do you see anything that shows the striking producing the flame in a necessary way? From Hume's empiricist standpoint, only three characteristics are ever present in what we label as causal events. First, there is spatial proximity. The cause and effect take place near each other in physical space. The strike and the flame both occur in the same immediate area. Second, there is temporal sequence. The cause consistently happens just before the effect. The flame appears only after the match is struck. Third, and most crucial, there is constant conjunction. Whenever the same type of cause occurs under similar conditions, it is regularly followed by the same type of effect. Over time, we observe that striking a match under the right circumstances reliably results in a flame. But beyond these three observable traits, Hume argued, Empirical observation provides no further insight into causation. What we do not and cannot observe, no matter how carefully we study such interactions, is what Hume termed necessary connection, that invisible force or compulsion that supposedly ensures an effect follows its cause. No matter how closely we examine the pattern of events, we never actually witness any metaphysical power transferring from cause to effect. We see regular sequences of events, but never the necessity itself that people often assume governs those sequences. Hume concluded that the notion of a necessary connection cannot be traced back to any sensory experience. Since it lacks a basis in observation, it has no legitimate role in empirical knowledge. What we interpret as necessity in causation is, in fact, a mental habit, an expectation generated by repeated exposure to patterns. When we insist that a struck match must produce a flame, we are really expressing the force of our mental expectation, not describing any inherent feature of the external world. This radical insight led Hume to completely rethink the definition of causation. Rather than being an unseen force operating within nature, causation, as he saw it, is simply the repeated observation of one type of event consistently following another. A cause in this framework is an event that precedes, is near to, and is regularly associated with another event, the effect. There is no hidden substance or deeper reality binding these events together. No metaphysical glue holding cause and effect in a necessary relationship. What we call causation is not a property of the world as it is, independent of us, but a descriptive framework we apply based on our experience. In this way, Hume shifted the understanding of causation from being an objective, external force to being a subjective principle that helps humans organize and interpret their sensory experiences. Hume's exploration of causation was groundbreaking, not only for its philosophical rigor, but also for its psychological insight. He contended that our conviction in a necessary connection between events stems from the repeated observation of consistent sequences. When we frequently witness one type of event followed by another, our minds become conditioned to anticipate the latter whenever the former occurs. Over time, this mental conditioning becomes so entrenched that we begin to attribute the sense of necessity to the events themselves, even though this connection exists only in our perception. The concept of causal necessity, according to Hume, arises not from any inherent feature of the events we observe, but from the psychological patterns formed by our habitual expectations. Our mental architecture compels us to expect outcomes based on past experiences, giving us the strong, though ultimately subjective, impression that causes and effects are intrinsically linked. This psychological interpretation of causality had far-reaching consequences for how science is understood. Rather than invoking obscure or hidden powers to account for natural phenomena, scientific laws, in Hume's view, are better seen as summaries of observed regularities. For instance, the law of gravitation does not uncover an underlying force compelling objects to fall. It simply quantifies the consistent way objects have behaved under observation. Likewise, the principles of chemistry do not expose the essential nature of matter, but instead encapsulate the recurring outcomes seen when substances interact in predictable ways. From this standpoint, science is primarily a descriptive enterprise. It focuses on recording and organizing patterns found in experience, not on discovering ultimate causes that lie behind those patterns. This empiricist perspective anticipated key trends in 20th century philosophy of science, which came to prioritize the predictive usefulness and functional role of scientific theories over their claims to metaphysical truth. Hume extended his causal theory to the realm of human behavior and ethics, probing how our understanding of causation affects concepts like free will and moral accountability. If causation consists merely in regular sequences rather than necessary links, what does it mean to claim that a person's choice causes an action? Hume maintained that human actions exhibit the same kind of predictable regularity seen in the physical world. Individuals with similar dispositions, placed in similar circumstances, tend to act in similar ways. These behavioral patterns allow us to anticipate and interpret human actions in much the same way we do natural phenomena. This predictability in behavior, however, doesn't rely on any hidden mental force driving actions. Just as physical regularities don't require the assumption of invisible powers, psychological causation arises from the same repeated associations observed by the human mind. Both domains function through the consistent conjunction of events as experienced by observers, without recourse to metaphysical necessities. Such a naturalistic outlook on human conduct inevitably raises critical issues about free will and moral responsibility. If our choices are determined by preceding events in the same way that physical events are, can we still be held accountable for them? Hume argued that moral responsibility does not hinge on being exempt from causal determination. Instead, it depends on the presence of the right kind of causal determination, namely one rooted in the agent's own character, motivations, and reasoning processes. According to Hume, we can rightly assign praise or blame when actions emerge from an individual's stable psychological traits, even if those traits themselves were shaped by earlier causes. What counts for moral evaluation is not whether behavior is uncaused or undetermined, but whether it arises from internal psychological mechanisms that are intelligible and morally relevant. This compatibilist stance, asserting that freedom and causal determination are not mutually exclusive, became a cornerstone for subsequent philosophical debates about the connection between causality and ethical judgment. Part 8. The Critique of Reason. David Hume crafted what many regard as the most thorough and penetrating critique of human reason in the history of philosophy. Unlike his predecessors, who largely took reason's authority for granted, Hume approached the subject with a rigorous examination of what reason is genuinely capable of achieving when stripped of unfounded assumptions. His inquiry uncovered that reason is far more constrained than previously believed. Yet he also recognized that humans are equipped with other psychological mechanisms that enable them to navigate life effectively, even in the absence of rational certainty. This insight reshaped the way philosophers understood the interplay between rational thought, belief, and practical action. Hume identified two fundamentally distinct modes of reasoning. The first, demonstrative reasoning, concerns itself with the relations between abstract ideas and can yield absolute certainty through logical deduction. Mathematics serves as the clearest example of this, where conclusions follow necessarily from definitions and axioms and cannot be denied without contradiction. For instance, when we prove that the interior angles of any triangle must add up to 180 degrees, we are not learning something about the physical world, but about the logical implications of our definitions of triangle and angle. Such reasoning is infallible within its limited scope, but that scope is confined to conceptual relationships, not to empirical facts. Demonstrative reasoning, therefore, tells us what must be true if certain assumptions are granted, but it cannot establish whether those assumptions, or the things they describe, actually exist in the real world. The second type, probable reasoning, addresses factual matters and draws conclusions about reality based on empirical evidence. This form of reasoning underpins the sciences, historical analysis, and our everyday judgments. Whether we're predicting tomorrow's weather from meteorological patterns or trusting a medicine based on clinical studies, we are engaging in probable reasoning. However, Hume demonstrated that such reasoning can never yield the same level of certainty as demonstrative reasoning. It always involves making inferences that go beyond the data at hand. Any conclusion about events we haven't observed rests on the assumption that nature behaves consistently, that the future will resemble the past, a principle that cannot itself be proven through logic or experience. As a result, probable reasoning is ultimately founded not on rational proof, but on psychological habits formed by repeated experience. This insight led Hume to a profound and unsettling conclusion. Reason can provide certainty only within the abstract world of ideas, not in the realm of empirical reality. All our knowledge about the world, about physical objects, other minds, memory, and even our sense of a continuous self, relies on beliefs that cannot be logically justified. They rest instead on natural tendencies of the human mind. Thus, Hume argued that the power of reason is far more limited than traditionally assumed. Nonetheless, he maintained that humans possess other mental faculties that enable them to operate effectively in the world, despite the shortcomings of rationality. Uncovering and understanding these non-rational elements of the mind became a central focus of Hume's broader philosophical project to develop a realistic theory of human nature. He devoted particular attention to the nature of belief and its connection to rational evidence. Hume observed that belief is not merely a matter of intellectually affirming a statement. Rather, it involves a unique psychological sentiment that sets it apart from mere imagination or hypothetical thinking. When someone believes it is raining outside, they don't just comprehend the sentence, "it is raining." They experience a particular mental stance or feeling toward that proposition, one that distinguishes it from idle speculation. Crucially, this sense of belief doesn't arise through reason alone. It depends on various psychological factors, such as the vividness of sensory impressions, the reliability of memory, and the habits formed through repeated experiences. Belief, then, is rooted more in the workings of the mind than in the structure of logical argument. It arises from emotional impulses and instinctive tendencies, often functioning independently of conscious reasoning. This realization led to the view that to truly grasp the nature of human knowledge, one must examine the psychological mechanisms behind it, rather than relying solely on abstract logical frameworks. The limitations of reason become particularly evident when considering its capacity to drive human behavior. Traditional philosophy maintained that reason could not only inform our beliefs, but also guide our actions. Many moral philosophers claim that rational contemplation could uncover objective moral principles, truths so compelling that anyone who properly understood them would naturally be inclined to act virtuously. Hume, however, firmly rejected this idea. He contended that reason alone is entirely powerless to incite any form of action. While reason can identify logical connections and determine the most efficient ways to reach a particular goal, it cannot establish the value or desirability of that goal. The true engines of human motivation are our feelings, our passions, emotions, and desires, which provide both the force and direction behind our actions. This line of thought led Hume to one of his most renowned assertions about the hierarchy between reason and emotion. He famously claimed that reason is, and ought only to be, the servant of the passions. It can never aspire to any role beyond that of assisting and executing the will of our desires. With this bold metaphor, Hume suggested that reason is not a source of ends or values, but a tool used to fulfill the aims set by our emotional nature. Reason can inform us about the logical consistency of our beliefs and forecast the outcomes of our decisions. Yet it is incapable of supplying the fundamental aims or ideals that shape the course of our lives. This utilitarian conception of reason stood in stark contrast to the long-held philosophical tradition that revered rational thought as the pinnacle of human nature and the ultimate guide to truth. Hume's critique extended beyond ethics and human behavior to challenge reason's supposed ability to uncover religious or metaphysical truths. For centuries, philosophers had argued that reason alone could prove the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the ultimate structure of reality, all without relying on empirical data. But when Hume subjected these arguments to scrutiny using his empiricist framework, he found them deeply flawed. He observed that many of these philosophical claims relied on notions that lacked any grounding in sensory experience or were based on flawed logical reasoning. Take, for example, the cosmological argument for the existence of God. It insists that every effect must have a cause, yet it inexplicably exempts God from this same requirement. Similarly, the ontological argument tries to derive actual existence from mere definitions, even though existence cannot be logically inferred from a concept alone. According to Hume, these arguments do not necessarily fail because of incorrect conclusions, but because they overreach the legitimate boundaries of reason, venturing into realms where empirical evidence and valid inference are absent. Even with this sweeping critique of reason's power, Hume did not descend into absolute skepticism or advocate for irrationalism. He acknowledged that no human being can truly live according to the extreme doubts that philosophical skepticism can produce. Even the most rigorous skeptic continues to believe in the physical world, relies on memory, and assumes the future will resemble the past in the practical flow of daily life. This observation suggests that while skeptical philosophy exposes the limits of reason's justificatory power, it does not invalidate the natural beliefs that structure human experience. For Hume, the appropriate response to these philosophical challenges is not hopelessness, but rather a tempered form of intellectual modesty. We must recognize the strengths of human reason without overestimating its reach. Reason should be pursued with vigor, but we must also accept that some questions lie outside its rightful domain. Understanding this balance for Hume was the key to both philosophical clarity and practical wisdom. Part 9. Taste, Beauty, and the Foundations of Aesthetic Judgment. David Hume's exploration of aesthetics revealed a familiar tension between individual subjectivity and universal claims, much like the dilemma he uncovered in his inquiries into moral sentiment and rational belief. In addressing questions of beauty, taste, and artistic value, Hume remained faithful to his empirical method, prioritizing how people actually form aesthetic judgments over attempts to derive them from abstract, universal laws. Rather than constructing ideal theories about beauty, Hume focused on observing how individuals experience and evaluate art in real life. His theory of aesthetic response became one of the most enduring and influential in philosophical aesthetics. He demonstrated that even though aesthetic reactions are rooted in personal emotions, these reactions can still form the basis for shared standards of artistic evaluation, without relying on beauty being an objective feature of the external world. Through this empirical lens, Hume helped shape the modern conception of how personal taste interacts with culturally informed standards of artistic excellence. By reflecting on his own aesthetic reactions and encouraging others to do the same, Hume identified a unique kind of emotional experience at the heart of aesthetic judgment, distinct from simple sensory enjoyment or moral approval. The experience of beauty arises naturally when we encounter something that pleases us in a particular way, yet this reaction differs significantly from a mere expression of personal liking. When someone declares a painting beautiful or a piece of music exceptional, they are not just stating a personal feeling, they are implying that others, if attentive and perceptive, should come to a similar judgment. According to Hume, aesthetic judgments are based on what he termed a sentiment of taste, which combines personal emotional response with a claim to shared validity. This sentiment is subjective in that it stems from emotional engagement rather than detached reasoning. Yet it is also intersubjective, as it seeks agreement from those with similar aesthetic capacities. Grasping this dual nature of aesthetic judgment was fundamental to Hume's account of how we evaluate art and beauty. Still, Hume acknowledged the persistent challenge posed by deep disagreements in matters of taste. What one person finds beautiful, another might find distasteful, and such differences are amplified by the wide variety of artistic traditions across cultures. If aesthetic judgment merely expresses individual feeling and not objective fact, then it would appear that all opinions on art are equally valid and that no rational basis exists for resolving disputes about artistic quality. Such a conclusion would threaten the entire framework of art criticism, aesthetic education, and cultural standards for evaluating artistic achievement. Hume sought to chart a middle path between two extremes: the relativistic view that treats all aesthetic opinions as equally valid, and the absolutist stance that anchors taste in fixed, objective features of artworks. His solution lay in identifying the conditions that enable aesthetic judgment to operate at its best and outlining the traits that mark a more refined sense of taste. Hume maintained that standards of taste emerge naturally from the proper functioning of human psychology under favorable conditions. While all aesthetic judgment involves subjective sentiment, not all individuals are equally equipped to make reliable or insightful judgments. Certain psychological traits make some people's aesthetic evaluations more dependable and authoritative than others. These traits include a delicacy of taste that enables sensitivity to subtle artistic details, broad experience that brings familiarity with diverse artistic styles and traditions, impartiality, which guards against bias, sound reasoning, which helps assess aesthetic relationships logically, and consistent practice, which hones perception through repeated exposure to excellent works of art. Those who possess these qualities to a high degree are what Hume called true judges, individuals whose aesthetic opinions offer the most trustworthy insight into artistic merit. The standard of taste, according to Hume, does not arise from fixed rules or objective features of artworks, but from the shared judgments of these qualified critics. By rooting aesthetic standards in the psychology of well-developed taste, Hume preserved the idea that some judgments are better than others, while also recognizing that such standards ultimately depend on human capacities rather than abstract principles. Hume's exploration of aesthetic judgment led him to profound conclusions about how aesthetic experience connects to broader psychological functions. He observed that the enjoyment we derive from art often stems from an appreciation of intricate relationships, such as those between parts and wholes, means and ends, or expressive forms and their meanings, that require advanced mental engagement. The appreciation of a musical piece, for example, may rely on the listener's ability to discern evolving patterns of repetition and variation over time. Similarly, a painting's appeal might rest in the delicate interplay of color, form, and subject, which only reveals its depth through attentive observation. This points to the fact that aesthetic evaluation draws not only on emotional responses, but also on cognitive faculties, with the latter primarily serving to deepen and sharpen our emotional engagement. From this, it follows that aesthetic education should nurture both an emotional responsiveness to beauty and an intellectual grasp of artistic methods and historical traditions. The highest forms of aesthetic discernment merge spontaneous emotional resonance with a refined understanding of how artistic techniques generate such responses. In addition to the psychological, Hume also considered the social and cultural aspects of aesthetic judgment. He recognized that our personal tastes evolve within the frameworks provided by our cultural environment, which offers exemplars of artistry, shared critical language, and communal reinforcement of aesthetic values. Different societies may cultivate unique aesthetic ideals and foster distinct artistic legacies. However, this diversity in cultural aesthetics does not automatically imply that aesthetic standards are entirely relative. Variations in preference may reflect alternative, equally valid ways of engaging with beauty, or they may indicate different stages of aesthetic maturity or cultural development. Making such distinctions calls for empirical study into the conditions that foster aesthetic excellence, rather than assuming that all cultural expressions are on equal footing or that one tradition alone holds the key to aesthetic truth. Hume's insights in this area prefigured later anthropological and sociological work on how art and aesthetic values are shaped by social forces. His approach opened the door to analyzing artistic meaning as a culturally constructed phenomenon, without losing sight of the possibility of meaningful aesthetic critique. The broader consequences of Hume's aesthetic theory reach into realms such as art criticism, cultural policy, and arts education. If aesthetic standards are grounded in the refined judgments of competent critics rather than in universal rules, then criticism should focus on cultivating and exercising refined taste, not on enforcing rigid theoretical systems. Critics, in this view, must develop the psychological capacities necessary for sound aesthetic appraisal, while also remaining receptive to innovative artistic expressions that may challenge existing categories. Likewise, education in the arts should prioritize developing a nuanced sensitivity to great works of art, rather than relying on rote learning of abstract aesthetic doctrines. Institutions such as museums, schools, and arts organizations play a vital role in this educational process. They should aim to foster environments where individuals can engage directly with high-quality art, cultivating their own aesthetic sensibilities while drawing on the heritage of established artistic traditions. This model of aesthetic education values immersive experience and gradual growth in critical appreciation. Hume's theory also sheds light on how aesthetic values relate to other forms of human value, especially moral ones. He maintained that while both aesthetic and moral judgments are rooted in sentiment rather than pure reason, they follow distinct principles and serve different purposes, even as both aim for a kind of shared, intersubjective validity. Whereas the value of a work of art lies in its ability to evoke appropriate aesthetic pleasure in perceptive viewers, moral value is based on actions or attitudes that support human well-being and social harmony. Because of this, aesthetic and moral evaluations can at times be at odds. For instance, when an artwork of great artistic merit depicts morally troubling content, or when morally uplifting acts fail to resonate aesthetically. Grasping these nuances is crucial for understanding how art fits into human life and how artistic and moral education should interact. Hume argued that the role of aesthetic experience in human flourishing is both unique and indispensable. It cannot be fully accounted for in terms of ethical, political, or utilitarian considerations. It offers a distinct mode of engagement with the world that enriches our lives in ways that go beyond mere function or morality. Hume's contributions to aesthetic philosophy have had a lasting impact well beyond the 18th century, continuing to inform modern conversations around artistic judgment, cultural critique, and the role of aesthetics in education. His formulation of the standard of taste played a pivotal role in shaping the evolution of art criticism and cultural theory, while his exploration of aesthetic judgment has deeply influenced both philosophical and psychological studies of aesthetic experience. Current discussions surrounding topics such as aesthetic relativism, cultural appropriation, and the construction of artistic canons still engage with the fundamental questions Hume raised in his systematic inquiry into aesthetic perception. His focus on the psychological underpinnings of aesthetic evaluation, along with the idea that aesthetic norms are socially shaped rather than universally fixed, prefigured many contemporary approaches in aesthetic theory. These approaches highlight the significance of viewing aesthetic experience as a natural human faculty that matures through engagement with culture and society. In this way, Hume's aesthetic thought remains highly relevant for those who seek to understand how aesthetic judgments are formed in practice, rather than prescribing how they should operate according to idealized, abstract standards. Ultimately, Hume's perspective continues to offer rich insights to both theorists and practitioners engaged in the analysis and critique of the arts today. Part 10. The Historian and the Science of Human Nature. David Hume's historical writings were not merely a departure from his philosophical endeavors, but a direct, practical extension of his empirical method applied to the grand narrative of human conduct throughout history. His extensive History of England, which occupied a significant portion of his later years, earned him considerably more recognition during his lifetime than his philosophical work ever did. This monumental project illustrated Hume's commitment to understanding human nature by closely examining how individuals behave under varying historical and societal circumstances. Rather than composing a traditional chronicle of events, Hume aimed to uncover the psychological and social principles that govern human actions. By identifying recurring patterns across various historical periods and cultural settings, he sought to reveal the deeper laws of human behavior. In doing so, Hume played a pivotal role in transforming history into a discipline capable of producing scientific insights about the nature of individuals and societies. Rejecting the conventional style of historical writing, one that emphasized the deeds of prominent leaders, military campaigns, and political milestones, Hume chose instead to explore the foundational causes behind historical transformations. He focused on the beliefs, customs, institutions, and material realities that shape the thoughts and actions of ordinary people. His methods centered on grasping the psychological makeup of historical participants, moving beyond mere narration of external events. While historical actors lived under different conditions and embraced different values across time, Hume believed they all shared fundamental psychological traits. These shared traits meant that, despite cultural variations, human beings responded in recognizable ways to similar psychological and situational pressures. Therefore, to truly comprehend historical change, one must identify the psychological and societal mechanisms that link specific contexts to specific behavioral outcomes across diverse periods and places. For Hume, this analytical approach made history a vital tool for understanding human nature, rather than simply a repository of moral lessons or dramatic anecdotes from the past. The philosophical underpinnings of Hume's historical method were deeply rooted in his earlier work on causation and induction in the natural sciences. Just as empirical science reveals consistent patterns in the physical world that enable prediction and control, Hume believed historical study could uncover regularities in human conduct, thereby advancing knowledge of social and political realities. However, he acknowledged that studying history comes with unique challenges not present in the natural sciences. Human behavior involves consciousness, intention, and cultural learning, leading to more intricate causal relationships than those found in purely physical systems. People's beliefs and values guide their actions, but these guiding principles are themselves shaped by the social environment and historical traditions, which continually evolve. Thus, explaining historical events requires an understanding of both the internal psychological forces driving individual behavior and the external social dynamics shaping collective ideas and institutions. This dual emphasis on the individual and the collective became a hallmark of Hume's historical methodology. Through his historical research, Hume identified significant trends in the development of political institutions that aligned with his philosophical ideas on government and political authority. He chronicled the progressive emergence of English constitutional governance, tracing its roots from medieval frameworks through the upheavals of the 17th century. In doing so, he illustrated how political structures evolved not from abstract ideals, but from the ongoing interaction between enduring human psychology and shifting societal conditions. According to Hume, developments such as the strengthening of parliamentary power, the establishment of legal protections for individuals, and the imposition of constitutional limits on the monarchy were practical solutions to immediate political dilemmas rather than deliberate implementations of theoretical doctrines. Political figures across different eras faced distinct challenges and had access to varying tools and institutions, but their underlying motivations, security, economic well-being, and social status remained constant. These common drives led to recurring patterns in political behavior. Recognizing these patterns allowed Hume to explain why certain political reforms endured while others failed, and why some nations were able to develop more stable and effective political systems than others. His work demonstrated that history, when analyzed through the lens of human psychology and empirical observation, could offer powerful insights into the mechanisms of societal progress. This examination of history substantiated Hume's philosophical claims regarding the conventional nature of political authority and underscored the critical role that institutional design plays in achieving political stability and success. The analysis of religious and intellectual history further supported Hume's exploration of how reason, belief, and social dynamics interact. He studied the diffusion and evolution of religious and philosophical ideas across societies, uncovering the psychological and sociocultural forces that shape how such beliefs emerge and transform over time. Movements in religion and philosophy often gain traction not because they are logically superior, but because they meet deep psychological needs, resonate with prevailing cultural norms, or align with the interests of powerful social actors. Even developments that seem purely rational, such as those during the scientific revolution, were driven by intricate social forces that defy explanation through logic alone. This historical inquiry into belief systems demonstrated the shortcomings of relying exclusively on rationalist frameworks to explain human opinion. Instead, it highlighted the significant influence of psychological and social dynamics, factors that are frequently overlooked by philosophers. From this historical vantage point, Hume's skepticism about the supremacy of reason was reaffirmed, while also offering a richer understanding of the organic processes by which knowledge is generated and evolves. Hume's historical approach also placed strong emphasis on the significance of economic and social conditions as core drivers of political and cultural transformation. He examined how shifts in trade, population dynamics, technological innovation, and patterns of social organization gave rise to new societal needs and tensions, necessitating institutional reforms and cultural change. For instance, the expansion of commerce and industry in early modern Europe fostered the emergence of new social classes, with priorities and values that diverged from those of agrarian societies. These changes contributed to political struggles and constitutional developments that could not be fully understood without reference to the underlying economic shifts. Similarly, advancements in military technology and organizational strategies reshaped the distribution of power among social groups, introducing new pressures that led to significant political restructuring and the evolution of modern state institutions. This materially grounded method of historical interpretation anticipated later trends in the social sciences, which increasingly stressed the role of economic and technological forces in driving social change. Yet Hume avoided falling into a rigid economic determinism by consistently acknowledging the psychological and cultural pathways through which material conditions exert their influence on human behavior and societal development. The practical relevance of Hume's historical methodology extended well beyond academic discourse. It offered valuable tools for analyzing contemporary political and social issues. By understanding how present-day institutions and norms emerged historically, one gains insight into their potential trajectories and the context in which they are most likely to function effectively. Historical reflection can uncover the unintended results of past decisions and institutional reforms, offering critical lessons for today's policymakers. It can also reveal the social and psychological environments that have historically either fostered or obstructed human well-being, thereby suggesting informed strategies for addressing modern challenges. However, Hume was clear that history cannot yield straightforward solutions to present-day problems. The uniqueness of each historical moment, combined with the unpredictable nature of human behavior, renders exact predictions or formulaic applications of past lessons impossible. Instead, Hume advocated for using historical knowledge to identify broad patterns and recurrent tendencies. The goal is not to mechanically replicate past outcomes, but to cultivate a nuanced understanding of the conditions under which particular social and political arrangements are likely to succeed or fail. David Hume's fusion of philosophical reasoning with historical inquiry laid the groundwork for an empirically grounded approach to the human sciences. This interdisciplinary model profoundly shaped the evolution of fields such as psychology, sociology, economics, and political science. By showcasing how methodical observation and analysis could yield deep insights into human nature and social structures, Hume demonstrated that meaningful knowledge about society need not rely on the controlled experimentation typical of the physical sciences. While experimental methods are often essential in natural science, they are frequently unfeasible when it comes to studying social dynamics. Historical analysis offers an alternative by serving as a form of natural experimentation. Different eras and cultures act as case studies, illustrating how human behavior adapts to varying circumstances and institutional frameworks. Through rigorous comparison of these historical cases, social scientists are able to discern broad patterns and governing principles of human conduct, all while accounting for the nuance and diversity inherent in social life. This method of comparative historical analysis eventually became a cornerstone of modern social science research. It continues to yield powerful insights into present-day societal and political challenges. Hume's contributions to history should therefore not be seen as a break from his philosophical pursuits, but as a logical extension of them, applying philosophical inquiry to the systematic, empirical study of human behavior in its full social and historical richness. Part 11. The lasting impact of human understanding. Nearly 300 years after David Hume concluded his groundbreaking exploration of human nature, his philosophical legacy remains deeply embedded in how educated individuals think about knowledge, reality, ethics, and society. His ideas continue to resonate across diverse academic disciplines and practical fields. By rigorously applying empirical methods to fundamental philosophical problems, Hume pioneered new ways of examining human experience. His work blurred traditional lines separating philosophy, psychology, and the social sciences, and the core issues he raised, as well as the strategies he employed to address them, are still central to today's intellectual landscape. As a result, Hume ranks among the most practically influential philosophers in history. To truly grasp the significance of his legacy, one must examine how subsequent thinkers have built upon, adapted, and extended his insights to address the enduring questions he first approached with systematic precision. Hume's exploration of the boundaries of human reason profoundly reshaped philosophical discourse on knowledge and reality. His argument that inductive reasoning cannot be logically justified without falling into circularity continues to provoke critical thought among scientists and philosophers in search of secure foundations for empirical knowledge. Modern philosophy of science has largely acknowledged Hume's conclusion that empirical evidence cannot conclusively prove scientific theories. This realization has given rise to more nuanced models of scientific reasoning, which focus on hypothesis testing, falsifiability, and the comparative evaluation of theories rather than definitive inductive justification. Similarly, contemporary epistemology has integrated Hume's observations about the psychological foundations of belief, leading to a more naturalistic approach that investigates how human cognition actually operates, rather than how it should function based on idealized logic. While the problem of induction remains unresolved in any final or universally accepted way, Hume's analysis still frames the discussion on how theoretical knowledge relates to empirical data. His influence is evident not just in academic theory, but also in practical arenas such as science education, policy development, and the teaching of critical thinking. Domains where the challenge of acting on incomplete or uncertain evidence must be squarely addressed despite philosophical skepticism. Equally significant is the wide-reaching effect of Hume's moral philosophy on modern ethical theory. His argument that moral conclusions cannot be logically derived from factual premises laid the groundwork for ongoing debates about the boundary between science and ethics, debates that continue to inform fields such as bioethics, environmental ethics, and social policy. Hume's focus on moral sentiment, rather than abstract rationality, anticipated the emergence of moral psychology as a scientific discipline that examines how people actually make ethical decisions, not merely how they should according to idealized theories. Contemporary research in areas like moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, and experimental philosophy has substantiated many of Hume's original claims regarding the emotional underpinnings of moral judgment, while expanding upon them with empirical tools that were unavailable in his era. His empirically grounded approach to ethics has also influenced practical fields such as moral education, conflict resolution, and social policy making, encouraging approaches that respect the realities of human psychology rather than imposing rigid, top-down moral systems. The dynamic tension Hume identified between the pursuit of moral objectivity and the influence of human sentiment continues to drive interdisciplinary research and debate. In political philosophy, Hume's influence endures through his emphasis on institutional structure and the empirical study of political behavior. His recognition that political authority ultimately depends on public opinion rather than coercive power shaped the evolution of democratic theory in the field of public opinion research. Hume's pragmatic approach to political design, favoring institutions that align with typical human motivations rather than relying on exceptional moral virtue, directly influenced the architects of the American Constitution. His insights remain highly relevant today, informing current debates about institutional reform, democratic resilience, and governance rooted in a realistic understanding of human nature. Hume's conception of political legitimacy, grounded in utility and convention rather than in natural rights or contractual agreements, continues to shape utilitarian frameworks in political assessment and policy formulation. Modern political science has deeply internalized his recognition of the centrality of political psychology and the often unintended effects produced by institutional structures. This influence has fostered robust empirical research that prioritizes understanding how political institutions actually operate in practice, rather than how they are ideally supposed to function according to abstract principles. Hume's legacy also extends into pragmatic domains such as constitutional engineering, electoral system design, and the administration of public affairs, areas where theoretical aspirations must be tempered by realistic insights into human psychological tendencies and societal constraints. Arguably, Hume's most enduring contributions lie not in the specific positions he took on philosophical issues, but in the methodological transformations he introduced. By systematically applying empirical techniques to philosophical inquiry, he helped redefine philosophy as a discipline that operates in concert with the natural and social sciences, rather than as a realm of isolated rational speculation. His insistence on grounding philosophical thought in psychological and social observation paved the way for the emergence of experimental psychology, the rise of empirical sociological methods, and the development of anthropological fieldwork, all of which aim to uncover the behavioral and structural dynamics underpinning human society. Moreover, his treatment of concepts as phenomena that can be empirically analyzed with respect to their origins and practical roles laid the groundwork for fields such as conceptual analysis, linguistic philosophy, and modern cognitive science. Hume's fusion of rigorous philosophical reasoning with historical inquiry set a precedent for interdisciplinary scholarship, bridging traditionally siloed academic disciplines to tackle multifaceted intellectual and societal questions. Today's scholarly and public spheres continue to benefit from the methodological precision and empirical mindset that Hume brought to bear on foundational issues concerning human nature and social organization. Beyond the walls of academia, Hume's thought has left a lasting imprint on contemporary culture, shaping discussions in education, public reasoning, and personal self-awareness. His nuanced exploration of the interplay between reason and emotion has had a profound effect on therapeutic practices in psychology and psychiatry, approaches that aim to engage with natural emotional processes rather than repress them. His ideas about the socially constructed nature of identity have informed current debates around personal growth, cultural affiliation, and the human need for belonging. His advocacy for intellectual humility and awareness of the inherent limitations of human cognition has informed more responsible modes of public discourse, ones that prioritize evidence and reason while remaining open to complexity and ambiguity. Hume's naturalistic view of moral and aesthetic judgment continues to shape present-day approaches to cultural analysis, artistic critique, and ethical education. These approaches favor nurturing innate human capacities over enforcing external norms through rigid or authoritarian means. The intellectual values that Hume embodied, curiosity, integrity, open-mindedness, and a firm commitment to evidence, remain powerful exemplars for both scholarly inquiry and civic life today. Perhaps most significantly, Hume's approach to the big questions of human existence serves as a template for engaging with complex issues through a blend of analytical precision, emotional sensitivity, and practical insight. He showed that philosophical depth need not lead to disillusionment or detachment. Rather, it can cultivate a deeper appreciation for the richness and intricacies of human life. Through his synthesis of skepticism and natural belief, Hume demonstrated that an honest reckoning with the limits of human knowledge can coexist with both pragmatic optimism and heartfelt engagement. His empirical orientation in tackling moral and political issues offered a middle path between authoritarian dogmatism and nihilistic relativism, an approach that remains highly relevant to the moral and political dilemmas of our time. Finally, Hume's method of integrating the study of individual psychology with broader social and historical forces provided a framework for understanding human behavior that avoids the extremes of both reductive individualism and sweeping social determinism. At the heart of his philosophy lies a steadfast dedication to grasping human nature as it truly is, grounded in observation and experience, rather than as idealized by traditional philosophical doctrines. This perspective forms the basis for approaches to personal growth and societal reform that align with rather than resist the fundamental traits of human psychology and the structures of social life. Although David Hume passed away in 1776, the issues he confronted and the tools he crafted to explore them remain strikingly pertinent nearly 300 years later. His body of work exemplifies how philosophy, at its most powerful, unites abstract theory with tangible relevance, sharp logical analysis with deep psychological understanding, and attention to individual experience with insight into collective dynamics. In a world still contending with ideological rigidity, entrenched polarization, growing social disconnection, and a bewildering mix of scientific advancement and ethical ambiguity, Hume's method of inquiry into human nature and the organization of society offers enduring guidance. His work serves as a reminder that profound philosophical reflection can remain both grounded and impactful. Perhaps his most lasting gift is the way he demonstrated that intellectual integrity, a commitment to empirical observation, and a sense of practical wisdom are not only compatible, they are mutually reinforcing. These qualities, when brought together, elevate rather than constrain our capacity for understanding and contribute meaningfully to human well-being. Though the science of human nature that Hume envisioned remains incomplete, his example continues to motivate those who aspire to confront the intricacies of human life with both fearless inquiry and genuine empathy. David Hume's legacy does not rest on definitive solutions to life's most enduring questions. Instead, it resides in the path he carved, one marked by a blend of rational skepticism and humane sensibility, traits that reflect the best of what human intellect and morality have to offer. Part 12, the is-ought problem. David Hume uncovered what is widely regarded as one of the deepest logical challenges in moral philosophy, a dilemma that still confronts anyone who tries to draw ethical conclusions solely from empirical facts. At the heart of this issue lies a crucial distinction between statements that describe the world as it is and those that prescribe how it ought to be. Hume observed a seemingly insurmountable logical gap between descriptive and normative claims. No matter how extensive our factual knowledge may be, it cannot, on its own, produce moral conclusions unless we first accept some underlying ethical principles. This insight, now famously known as the is-ought problem, or Hume's guillotine, transformed the philosophical landscape by reshaping how we understand the connection between facts and values, science and ethics, and reason and moral judgment. The problem becomes particularly evident when we look at common forms of moral reasoning that attempt to move from empirical observations to ethical judgments. For instance, one might claim that stealing is morally wrong because it causes harm to others, erodes trust within society, and hinders economic collaboration. These are factual statements that may be supported by evidence. However, Hume emphasized that these facts alone do not establish the moral wrongness of stealing. To arrive at that conclusion, one must also hold certain normative assumptions, such as the belief that causing unnecessary harm is ethically objectionable, or that trust and cooperation are moral goods. Without these additional moral premises, the empirical claim that stealing causes harm does not logically lead to the conclusion that stealing is wrong. But here's the critical point. Those moral assumptions themselves cannot be derived from facts alone. Any attempt to justify them based purely on observation ends up reintroducing the same kind of normative premise, thus falling into the very same logical trap. In other words, every effort to deduce an ought from an is involves sneaking in value-based assumptions that themselves lack purely factual justification. Hume clarified this logical problem by analyzing the structure of moral arguments in detail. He noted that, in every ethical theory he had encountered, the author typically began by describing human nature, social behaviors, or the consequences of various actions. Yet at a certain point, the argument would subtly shift, from stating what is the case to asserting what ought to be done. He famously remarked that he was struck by the moment when, after a string of descriptive claims using terms like is and is not, the discussion would suddenly introduce statements involving ought or ought not. This shift, though often subtle, represents a logical leap that isn't supported by the same form of reasoning used to establish the initial factual claims. The transition from factual to moral language brings in entirely new concepts that demand a different kind of justification. Yet many moral philosophers have traditionally glossed over this transition, treating it as if it were logically seamless. Hume, in contrast, challenged them to clarify how this leap from descriptive facts to normative conclusions is supposed to work, and to identify the type of reasoning that could validly connect the two. This insight had far-reaching consequences for Hume's broader view of the relationship between scientific inquiry and ethical evaluation. While science excels at uncovering truths about the physical world and social systems, it cannot, by its very nature, determine what moral stances we should take. Empirical research can tell us what causes certain behaviors, how moral judgments arise, and what societal impacts various ethical systems may have. Yet all this empirical knowledge leaves untouched the central moral question: which values ought to guide our actions, both individually and collectively? Science can inform our ethical thinking by revealing potential outcomes of our choices, but it cannot settle ethical debates by itself. It cannot deliver definitive answers to questions of right and wrong purely through data or observation. This underscores a crucial distinction. Moral inquiry and scientific investigation are concerned with fundamentally different types of questions and require distinct intellectual approaches. Neither domain can be wholly reduced to the other. Finally, Hume's critique exposed key aspects of moral reasoning and the language we use to express ethical beliefs, dimensions of moral psychology and discourse that had often been taken for granted. His analysis continues to challenge modern philosophers to reckon with the complex interplay between facts and values, and to confront the limitations of reason in the moral domain. Moral judgments go beyond simply stating facts about the world or society. They express unique stances of approval or disapproval that are inherently emotional and motivational. When someone claims that honesty is virtuous or that cruelty is wrong, they are not just making neutral observations about the outcomes of those behaviors. They are also conveying their own moral feelings and attempting to influence how others feel and behave. In this way, moral language serves a dual role, which philosophers today refer to as both descriptive and prescriptive. It communicates moral views while also seeking to shape them. Recognizing this dual nature of moral language helps clarify why moral disagreements often provoke stronger emotional responses and carry more practical weight than disputes over matters of fact. David Hume's famous "is ought" problem had far-reaching consequences for how he viewed the role of reason in moral thought. If moral conclusions cannot be logically inferred from purely factual statements, then reason has a more limited function in ethical judgment than many earlier philosophers had believed. Reason can be invaluable in clarifying meanings, uncovering contradictions, anticipating outcomes, and highlighting overlooked aspects of moral situations. However, it cannot, on its own, generate the core values and commitments needed to support moral reasoning. These foundational moral premises originate from different sources, namely the innate emotional capacities and social experiences that Hume explored in his moral psychology. This does not mean that moral judgment is irrational or random. Rather, it suggests that moral reasoning is grounded in psychological tendencies and social influences that do not follow the same rules as formal logic. Hume's resolution to the "is ought" problem involved redirecting focus away from trying to deduce moral rules through logical steps. Instead, he examined the psychological and social mechanisms by which moral beliefs form and operate. He shifted the central question of ethics from "how can we logically justify moral claims?" to "how do such judgments arise in real human experience, and what purposes do they serve?" From this standpoint, the primary task of moral philosophy is not to search for abstract logical foundations, but to explore the development of moral feelings and the social conditions that support ethical behavior conducive to human well-being. Ethics, on this view, becomes closely aligned with empirical disciplines like psychology and sociology, rather than remaining a purely deductive field rooted in reason alone. This naturalistic perspective on the "is ought" gap foreshadowed numerous later developments in moral philosophy that stress the importance of understanding the psychological, evolutionary, and cultural dimensions of ethical systems. While contemporary philosophers still grapple with the logical challenge Hume identified, many now follow his lead in prioritizing an investigation into how moral thinking actually functions over attempts to provide absolute rational justifications for moral beliefs. This shift in focus has fueled a wide range of productive research in areas like moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, experimental philosophy, and applied ethics, fields that emphasize real-world moral behavior and the cultivation of attitudes that promote both personal and societal flourishing. Hume's analysis of the as-ought distinction remains a cornerstone in modern debates about the connection between science and ethics, the structure of moral reasoning, and the most appropriate methods for doing moral philosophy. Part 13. Justice and the Artificial Virtues. David Hume advanced a groundbreaking theory of justice in social institutions, demonstrating that intricate moral and political systems can emerge organically from basic psychological traits without the need for centralized control or deliberate design. His study of what he termed the artificial virtues uncovered how humans, through accumulated social experience, rather than coercion or formal consensus, have built enduring institutions such as property rights, legal systems, and governments. Hume's framework redirected the focus of political philosophy away from abstract theorizing and toward the empirical study of how human psychology and social dynamics naturally give rise to moral and political norms. He championed the view that understanding the spontaneous development of these institutions is more valuable than constructing idealized political models based solely on reason. His ideas laid the intellectual groundwork for later theories that emphasized emergent order, cultural evolution, and the unintended consequences of individual actions. Central to Hume's theory is the distinction he made between two categories of moral virtues, each rooted in distinct psychological mechanisms and serving different purposes within society. Natural virtues, such as kindness, gratitude, and empathy, stem directly from innate human emotions. These virtues motivate individuals to act morally without the need for formal institutions or learned behaviors. For example, when you instinctively respond to someone suffering with compassion and assistance, you are guided by a natural virtue, one that arises spontaneously from emotional resonance. These virtues are universal, found in every culture, because they reflect deep-seated elements of human psychology that do not rely on specific social structures or customs. In contrast, artificial virtues are moral norms and practices that depend on particular social settings and evolve only within structured human interaction. Qualities such as justice, honesty in commerce, allegiance to political systems, and respect for property are not driven by instinctive emotions, but rather by shared expectations and learned behaviors that develop within a cultural framework. Among these, justice stands out as the most illustrative case of how complex moral systems can arise from simple mental processes without the guidance of a central planner or a unifying rational doctrine. Hume sought to explain why societies develop rules around property, rules that, on the surface, constrain individual freedom by preventing people from taking whatever they desire from communal resources. He proposed that this development does not result from an innate moral instinct or rational calculation, but from a slow and collective realization. Cooperation through restraint in the use and possession of resources better serves everyone's interests than unregulated competition. In small, close-knit communities with plentiful resources, people can afford to share freely and resolve disputes personally, relying on immediate reciprocity and interpersonal bonds. However, as populations expand and resources grow limited, unrestrained competition leads to conflict and instability. Under these conditions, people gradually come to see the advantage of following rules that regulate ownership and exchange. The recognition that long-term benefits arise from mutual restraint gives rise to the practice of justice as an artificial virtue. This realization does not emerge through formal negotiations or philosophical agreement. Instead, it evolves from continuous social interaction, where individuals begin to notice that some behaviors, like honoring property claims and fulfilling agreements, foster cooperation, while others result in strife and mutual harm. As these cooperative behaviors are repeated and reinforced, they solidify into social norms. When individuals reliably respect each other's property and honor their promises, a climate of trust is cultivated. This trust, in turn, makes productive labor and voluntary trade more likely. In contrast, when these norms are regularly broken, cooperation deteriorates. People become more focused on guarding their possessions than creating value, and the community suffers as a whole. Through this gradual process of learning and adaptation, successful societies establish increasingly elaborate systems of property rights, legal contracts, and mechanisms for resolving disputes. These institutions grow out of basic psychological tendencies toward reciprocity and social coordination, not from the enforcement of rational ideals or moral abstractions. They represent the accumulated wisdom of communities, learning how to structure their lives in ways that sustain human well-being. David Hume argued that the virtue of justice is not innate, but rather arises from what he termed a convention, a gradually evolving practice shaped by social interaction rather than by formal agreement. In Hume's specialized use of the term, a convention refers to a stable and mutually beneficial pattern of behavior and expectations that becomes established without the need for centralized authority or explicit enforcement. To illustrate, think of how drivers in a society come to travel on a particular side of the road. There is no intrinsic moral value in choosing the left or right side. What matters is that everyone adheres to the same side to ensure safety and efficiency. This coordinated behavior arises naturally as individuals recognize the advantages of predictability. Over time, this practice becomes self-reinforcing, since anyone who deviates from the norm faces personal inconvenience or danger. In much the same way, systems of property rights develop as conventions that help coordinate individual actions in a way that benefits all. These systems persist because violating property norms disadvantages the violator, while respecting them contributes to collective and individual well-being. Understanding justice as a convention has significant consequences for how we approach moral disagreements and variations in legal or political practices across cultures. Since justice stems from socially constructed norms rather than from inherent moral instincts, we should expect diverse societies to create different sets of rules and institutions concerning property, contracts, and governance. These differences do not imply that all societal structures are equally effective or immune to critique. While diverse societies may adopt varied but equally valid approaches based on their unique histories, environments, and cultural contexts, some systems are more conducive to human flourishing than others. It remains entirely appropriate to evaluate and critique institutions based on their outcomes and their ability to support well-being. Empirical research can help identify the conditions under which beneficial institutions are most likely to arise and endure. However, this perspective also suggests that moral and political theorists should concentrate on how institutions emerge and evolve through natural social processes. Attempting to construct ideal political systems from purely abstract principles without regard for human psychology and social dynamics risks producing impractical or unsustainable models. Hume's examination of artificial virtues also offers important guidance for moral education and policymaking, especially in the context of character development and political reform. Since these virtues depend on learned social conventions, moral instruction should emphasize understanding the roles and functions of moral and legal institutions, not merely obedience to abstract rules. People are more inclined to honor property rights, keep contractual commitments, and abide by laws when they comprehend how these norms serve their own long-term interests and help maintain a stable and cooperative society. In the same vein, political reform should aim to incrementally improve existing institutions by building upon established conventions. Attempting to abruptly impose entirely new systems that disregard entrenched social habits often leads to the breakdown of valuable institutions without delivering effective replacements. For reform to succeed, it must be grounded in a clear understanding of the organic ways in which institutions grow and adapt. This insight allows for changes that strengthen human flourishing while preserving the cooperative structures that support social order. Hume's framework anticipated many later developments in fields such as social theory, economics, and political science. These disciplines have since highlighted the importance of spontaneous social evolution, the emergence of order without central direction, and the unintended consequences of human action. His recognition of justice as a product of convention influenced economists who studied how markets function and evolve without top-down control, political theorists who examined the development of democratic institutions, and anthropologists who explored the cultural roots of moral and legal systems. By emphasizing the unplanned, gradual nature of institutional development, Hume offered a perspective that avoided the extremes of both individualism, which overlooks social context, and collectivism, which assumes institutions are entirely the result of deliberate design. His balanced approach remains highly relevant today, shaping ongoing debates about the role of individual liberty versus social cooperation, the appropriate scope of government intervention in the economy, and the complex ties between moral principles and political structures. Part 14. Hume's Critique of Miracles and Religious Authority. David Hume crafted what is widely regarded as the most powerful philosophical challenge to the credibility of miracle reports, a critique so meticulously reasoned and rooted in empirical logic that it continues to trouble religious thinkers nearly 300 years later. His treatment of miracles exemplifies his broader philosophical method, confronting traditionally accepted beliefs with the tools of empirical investigation and probabilistic reasoning. Hume did not simply dismiss religion outright. Instead, he offered a deeply analytical exploration into the psychological and logical underpinnings of religious belief. His goal was to assess claims not on the basis of tradition, faith, or authority, but according to evidence and reason. In doing so, he exposed critical flaws in conventional approaches to religious knowledge and belief. His examination of miracles became a foundational example of how scientific thinking could be brought to bear on religious assertions. It laid the groundwork for a modern view of the relationship between extraordinary claims and empirical evidence, underscoring the principle that such claims demand equally extraordinary proof. At the outset, Hume carefully clarified what distinguishes miracle claims from ordinary empirical observations. A miracle, he argued, must involve a breach of the laws of nature, caused by a divine or supernatural agent. This definition highlights what gives miracles their religious significance. They signify direct intervention by a deity into the course of natural events, overriding the usual causal structure of the physical world. But this very definition also reveals why miracle claims pose such serious challenges to empirical reasoning. Because miracles by nature violate the most well-supported principles of how the world operates, they must be exceedingly rare. This rarity is not incidental, but essential to their status as miracles. If such events occurred frequently or predictably, they would no longer stand apart from the regular order of nature and thus would not qualify as miracles at all. From this starting point, Hume developed the core logic of his argument. When someone asserts that a miracle has taken place, we are faced with a fundamental choice between two possibilities. Either a genuine miracle occurred, requiring that the known laws of nature were suspended, or the individual making the claim is mistaken, deceived, or intentionally deceptive. To assess these competing explanations, Hume insisted we rely on our broader experience of the world. Our accumulated observations overwhelmingly support the consistency and reliability of natural laws. At the same time, we have abundant evidence that human testimony is fallible. People misperceive, misremember, misjudge, and are sometimes motivated to lie or exaggerate due to psychological or social pressures. With this context in mind, Hume concluded that reason will always favor a natural explanation over a supernatural one when evaluating a reported miracle. The strength of our empirical knowledge about natural law constitutes what he called a full proof against any specific miracle claim. In other words, it is always more likely that the testimony is flawed than that a law of nature has truly been violated. Importantly, Hume did not claim that miracles are metaphysically impossible. Rather, he maintained that it is never rational to believe in a miracle solely on the basis of human testimony. A wise individual, he argued, adjusts their belief according to the quality of the evidence, and in every case, the evidence from nature is more reliable and extensive than any anecdotal report. The more astonishing a claim is, the more substantial the supporting evidence must be in order for belief in it to be rational. But no human testimony, no matter how sincere or detailed, can ever rise to the level required to overturn our well-established understanding of how the world works. This leads to a stark conclusion. Belief in miracles, when based purely on testimonial evidence, is always epistemically unjustified. Hume thus established a formidable philosophical barrier to the rational acceptance of miracles, one that continues to influence debates about religious authority and the credibility of supernatural claims to this day. Hume reinforced his critique by analyzing the historical and psychological contexts in which miracle reports tend to emerge. He observed that such accounts are particularly prevalent among societies lacking scientific understanding. Groups he described as uneducated or culturally primitive, where people are more inclined to explain unusual events through supernatural causes. As societies progress and develop more rigorous scientific frameworks and evidence-based reasoning, reports of miracles tend to diminish in both frequency and societal impact. This historical trend implies that belief in miracles is more a reflection of ignorance about natural phenomena than evidence of divine intervention. Hume further emphasized that miracle narratives often accompany the rise of new religious movements or serve specific religious or political interests. These scenarios naturally encourage exaggeration, distortion, or even outright invention of miraculous events to bolster particular agendas. Human psychology plays a central role as well. People tend to assign purpose and meaning to improbable coincidences, and social pressures to conform can reinforce the acceptance and spread of such stories, even when no true supernatural event has taken place. The implications of Hume's argument stretch beyond miracles alone, touching on broader questions about religious belief and the tension between faith and reason. If rational analysis of evidence cannot substantiate miracle claims, then religions that rely on these events for legitimacy are grounded not in empirical reality, but in psychological and social dynamics. This doesn't necessarily render religious belief irrational, but it does suggest that faith operates on a plane separate from evidence-based justification. Those who maintain belief in miracles despite logical inconsistencies are often guided more by human needs for meaning, identity, and community than by strict adherence to reason. Hume proposed that such psychological insight offers a more accurate lens for understanding religious belief than traditional theological methods that aim to prove religious doctrines through logic. In his view, exploring the emotional and existential functions of religion may yield deeper understanding of human nature than abstract debates over the existence or characteristics of a deity. His critique of miracles also had significant consequences for how we think about the credibility of historical claims and the standards of rational belief. Hume introduced principles for evaluating extraordinary assertions that apply not just to religion, but to any domain of knowledge. When faced with a claim that contradicts established empirical understanding, one must assess both the reliability of the sources making the claim and the robustness of the knowledge being challenged. The more improbable the claim, the more credibility and corroboration its proponents must provide. In fact, no amount of testimonial evidence can rationally support a claim that directly opposes well-substantiated scientific knowledge. This framework has since become a foundational element in the philosophy of science and critical thinking education. It offers a disciplined method for distinguishing genuine discoveries from baseless speculation or manipulation. Hume's analysis, therefore, not only reshaped religious philosophy, but also contributed enduring insights into the broader process of empirical reasoning and the evaluation of evidence. The philosophical consequences of Hume's argument continue to provoke debate among scholars, theologians, and scientists. Some critics contend that Hume assumes the immutability of natural laws from the outset, thereby dismissing the possibility of miracles by default. Others defend him, arguing that he simply applies a consistent standard of empirical evaluation to all claims, religious or otherwise. In response to Hume's critique, some religious thinkers have shifted toward forms of faith that do not depend on miracles, while others have attempted to redefine miracles in ways that sidestep his objections. Contemporary discussions at the intersection of science and religion still wrestle with the fundamental issues Hume raised. Chief among them, how to appropriately weigh empirical evidence in relation to supernatural claims, and how to logically reconcile natural and transcendent explanations. Regardless of where one stands on the question of religious truth, Hume's dissection of miracle claims remains a benchmark of philosophical clarity and logical consistency. It underscores the need to apply the same standards of reasoning to all empirical assertions, no matter how culturally or spiritually significant they may be. His approach has had a lasting influence on how educated individuals engage with the concepts of belief and evidence, shaping modern discourse well beyond the confines of religious debate. Part 15. Political Philosophy and the Science of Government. David Hume examined political issues using the same empirical methods he applied to all areas of human life, viewing government and political systems as natural outgrowths of human behavior that could be studied through observation and analysis. Rather than grounding his political thought in abstract notions like natural rights, social contracts, or idealized governmental forms, Hume focused on how institutions actually arise and operate within societies. His political theory was rooted in the belief that systems of governance must align with human psychological tendencies, rather than expecting individuals to overcome their inherent mental and emotional limitations in the name of civic virtue. This pragmatic stance had far-reaching consequences for how we conceptualize constitutional frameworks, the limits of governmental power, and the balance between personal freedom and collective order. Hume openly rejected the dominant Enlightenment idea that legitimate government is necessarily founded on the explicit consent of the governed, expressed through an original social contract. Through historical inquiry, he discovered that most governments did not originate from consensual agreements among free and equal individuals, but rather through conquest, the slow evolution of social practices or practical adaptations to specific historical contexts. In most cases, citizens are born into existing political systems and become subject to institutions that predate them and will outlast them. According to Hume, the idea of a foundational social contract was a fiction, an imagined event that never truly took place, offering no real explanation for the origins of political legitimacy or the reasons people accept political authority. To truly understand political obedience, Hume argued, we must examine the psychological and sociocultural mechanisms that create patterns of allegiance and compliance, rather than searching for hypothetical moments of original agreement. This historical and psychological lens became the cornerstone of Hume's political thought. Hume contended that the duty to obey political authority is not grounded in formal consent, but instead in shared conventions and the principle of utility. These same foundations underpin other artificial moral constructs, such as justice and the keeping of promises. People come to accept political authority because, over time, they realize that social stability serves their personal interests more effectively than disorder or lawlessness, even when specific laws or government actions run counter to their immediate desires. This understanding arises not from deliberate reasoning or contractual agreement, but through lived experience, as individuals observe the tangible benefits of predictable institutions and legal frameworks. Legitimacy, then, is not the result of conscious consent, but of a government's ability to perform crucial social functions that people come to recognize and appreciate. When a government consistently ensures public welfare and upholds social order, it naturally gains the support of its citizens, not because of any theoretical justification, but because it works. Hume's utilitarian perspective suggested that the proper metric for judging political systems is not their adherence to abstract moral ideals, but their capacity to foster human well-being more effectively than other available options. Through his investigation into political psychology, Hume illuminated the conditions under which institutions can maintain stability and effectiveness over time. He identified public opinion as the fundamental basis of all political power, asserting that authority is sustained more by the attitudes and beliefs of citizens than by laws or coercive force. No government, regardless of its strength, can endure if it loses the habitual support and acceptance of those it rules. Even the mechanisms of enforcement, such as the military and police, are composed of individuals whose willingness to uphold government authority depends on their own perceptions of its legitimacy and competence. To truly understand political stability, one must look beyond formal constitutions or the distribution of coercive power. The focus should instead be on how public opinion is formed and transformed over time. Governments that succeed do so by fostering a psychological environment in which citizens willingly accept and comply with authority, not merely by instilling fear of punishment or legal consequences. David Hume recognized the centrality of opinion in sustaining political authority, and he distinguished between different kinds of opinion that play distinct roles in legitimizing governance. The first, which he termed opinion of interest, refers to the widespread perception that governmental institutions effectively serve the population's material needs by preserving public order, securing property rights, and encouraging economic development. When people come to believe that their practical interests are better served by the existing political system than by any alternative, they tend to develop ingrained habits of compliance. This psychological disposition is what gives political authority its durability and strength. A second category, known as the opinion of right, involves citizens' beliefs about the moral legitimacy of the political system and the fairness of power distribution within it. Even if a government is materially effective, it may still encounter resistance if it is perceived as unjust or lacking moral legitimacy by prevailing ethical standards. Therefore, a truly stable government must appeal not only to practical outcomes, but also to deeply held values and widely accepted notions of justice and procedural fairness. Hume's empirically grounded political philosophy led him to profound insights about how constitutions should be structured and how institutions ought to function. He maintained that the most effective governments are those that achieve public good through systems that align with basic human psychological tendencies, rather than relying on extraordinary moral virtue or exceptional rationality from political actors. Thus, institutional frameworks should be built with the expectation that individuals will primarily act in accordance with their self-interest, rather than in pursuit of abstract ethical ideals. Well-designed institutions use incentives to guide self-interested behavior toward outcomes that benefit society as a whole. This perspective underscores the value of mechanisms such as the separation of powers, checks and balances, and other constitutional structures that serve to prevent the excessive concentration of authority, which might otherwise lead to corruption or tyranny. Hume argued that effective governance depends more on sound institutional design than on the personal virtue of leaders, although both are relevant. Systems that rely chiefly on the moral integrity of individual office holders are inherently unstable, as there is no assurance that future leaders will possess the same ethical standards or dedication to the public good. These principles regarding institutional structure also shaped Hume's analysis of various governmental forms and informed his projections about how political systems might evolve over time. He showed particular interest in the English constitutional model, which he saw as a powerful example of how a monarchy could gradually transform into a more liberal system without the need for violent upheaval or wholesale constitutional reformation. The English system, in Hume's view, had managed to secure many of the benefits typically associated with democratic governance. It did this by limiting the powers of the monarchy, safeguarding individual liberties, and maintaining political stability, all while preserving continuity with national traditions. Still, Hume acknowledged that institutional designs that function effectively in one historical context might lose their efficacy as social and economic conditions shift. For political institutions to remain legitimate and functional, they must strike a balance between resilience and adaptability. The enduring challenge of constitutional design lies in achieving this balance, preserving the core purposes that justify a political system's existence, while allowing enough flexibility to respond to the inevitable transformations in society over time. This dynamic tension between institutional stability and capacity for reform is at the heart of long-term political success. David Hume's political philosophy explored fundamental issues surrounding the limits of state power and the balance between personal freedom and societal stability. He dismissed both extremes, those advocating for absolute governmental control and those promoting minimal state involvement, to the extent that essential societal coordination would collapse. Hume argued that governmental authority plays a critical role in preserving justice, safeguarding property rights, delivering public goods, and mediating disputes that might otherwise lead to disorder. However, he also recognized that political power, if left unchecked, poses significant dangers of tyranny and misuse. To counter these risks, he insisted on the need for robust institutional checks and clearly defined constitutional boundaries. He maintained that determining the appropriate functions of government is an empirical matter, relying on practical observations about which societal needs can be met through voluntary collaboration and which require legally backed, centralized governance. These determinations are not universally fixed. They vary across societies depending on unique factors, such as their economic conditions, historical context, and cultural values. This realistic, evidence-based orientation toward political questions contributed to Hume's enduring influence on later political thinkers. Those looking for a path between revolutionary upheaval and rigid traditionalism found in Hume a compelling advocate for gradual institutional reform. His caution toward idealistic political designs, coupled with his awareness of unintended consequences, helped shape the core tenets of political liberalism. Hume's reflections also had a lasting impact on the emergence of constitutional democracy. His exploration of how psychological factors underpin political authority and his recognition of the powerful role of public opinion laid important groundwork for modern political science and democratic theory. Today's debates on institutional frameworks, the legitimacy of political power, and the interaction between individual rights and collective welfare continue to be informed by the insights he first offered. Through his comprehensive analysis of political dynamics, Hume provided a framework that remains essential for those seeking to understand the real-world functioning of political systems, not just their idealized versions. His pioneering contributions to the empirical study of governance continue to offer crucial guidance for contemporary political theory and institutional reform.